Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is Andrew Ross, one of the organizers of Palestine Writes, and also serve in the organizing committee of USACB, the American branch of the BDS movement. I'd like to draw your attention to the ACA showroom on the VFAIR's website, where you can find booksellers and other vendors. And for those of you who might have missed sessions on previous days and want to view them, some of the recordings have begun to be posted on the website. They're up 48 hours after they've been broadcast, but some of them are up already, and you can view them just by going to the halls where the session took place and click on the day of the actual event. And lastly, if you are engaging in social media, use the hashtag Palestine Writes. I'm going to introduce David Palumbo-Liu now, who is going to moderate this panel. And he's also one of the organizers of Palestine Writes. And like myself, he's on the organizing committee of USACB. He's a professor of comparative literature at Stanford University, and his many and multifarious writings have appeared in a range of major newspapers and magazines, as well as scholarly venues. And so I'm going to turn this over to you, David.
Great. Thanks a lot, Andrew. I'm just going to say a few words about this panel and then introduce the panelists. So the description in the program says cultural dislocation and dissonance. We'll touch on the phenomenon of writing one's identity and culture in a language and or land that are foreign to that culture. In other words, what's it like to write in English about a very different identity and culture that has been tortured and violated by the culture and language that you're communicating with. And I'd like to extend this to include also the issue of literary form and genre, and the ways that all these elements of writing carry with them encodings of domination and colonial history. For example, in yesterday's session on science fiction, the authors spoke about how the narrative of exploration or discovery automatically carries with it the tonality of colonialism. And we can also think about how the genre of memoir, for example, carries with it the resonance of a confessional, or how autobiographic writing carries with it a very specific sense of the individual self, which is not at all universal, but very culturally coded. So I invite each of us to broaden this discussion in any way we see fit. And that includes relocating and putting into harmony new visions of the future, which has been a subject that has been widely discussed in the festival so far. And in my introduction of each of the panelists, I'll indicate how they each are doing exactly this in their own writing. I'll stay at the beginning. Unfortunately, Nick Estes is not able to join us. He sends his apologies. He's unable to join for circumstances way beyond his control, but he does say that he's here with us in spirit. So our first speaker is Sophia Azeb, who's an assistant professor of Black Studies in the Department of English, Language, and Literature at the University of Chicago. Her current book project, Another Country, Constellations of Blackness in Afro-Arab Cultural Expression, examines how Blackness and Black identity is variously translated, mobilized, circulated, and contested by African-American, Afro-Caribbean, African, and Afro-Arab cultural and political figures in North Africa and Europe in the 20th century. She's a regular contributor to Funambulist magazine. And actually, when I was watching the panel on science fiction, I was reminded of one of her essays in Funambulist, which I recommend to everybody. It's entitled, "Who Will We Be When We Are Free on Palestine and Futurity?" And it appears in the July-August edition of Funambulist, which is about futurism. So it ties in very nicely to some of the things hopefully we'll talk about today. And I'm also delighted to introduce Fady Joudah, who's a Palestinian American poet and physician. He has published 4 collections of poems. These are The Earth in the Attic, A Light, Text 2, a book-long sequence of short poems whose meter is based on cell phone character count, and most recently, footnotes in the order of disappearance. He has translated several collections of poetry from the Arabic and is the co-editor and co-founder of Adan Poetry Prize. He's also the winner of the Yale Series of Younger Poets competition in 2007 and has received a PEN Award, Bonaparte Times Literary Supplement Prize in the UK, and the Griffin Poetry Prize and a Guggenheim Fellowship. I moderated a panel with Naomi Shihab Nye yesterday, and I was reminded her description of Fady's poetry, which really connects again to the subject of today's talk. She writes, "This is what we have had to do amid the pandemic, grief, political chaos, fires, human rights disasters, to continue with our lives, doing chores, taking walks, teaching kids, trying to stay steady." Fady Joudah writes about the mysterious cosmos swirling with intricate linkages as his phone is pinging. "Ah, yes, Jerusalem, the holy city. Right now, let's call all our cities holy. Let's hope our trees continue to communicate whatever humans can or can't accomplish." So we'll begin with Sophia and then hear from Fady. And since Nick is unable to join us, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So if you can make comments in the chat, but if you want to ask a question and have one of the speakers respond, please put it in the Q&A and we'll be sure to get to as many as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that really thoughtful introduction. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the Palestine Writes Festival for inviting me to join this conversation. I'm very humbled to be here and to be speaking with Fady and, of course, with the spirit of Nick, who actually just texted me another little message to share, if you don't mind. Nick Estes says he's very sorry he couldn't join us. The reason he is not able to is that he's trying to be in solidarity with Venezuela and got stuck in transit, but he adds free Palestine. So I'm sure we all understand that he couldn't be with us for those reasons. I'm speaking to you now from the homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, and the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations. Many other nations, including the Miamia, Wea, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Thakiwaki, Meskwaki, Kikiapoi, and Muscatoon peoples also call this region home. And as David indicated, I'm probably going to take one of the unusual tacks to addressing the themes of today's panel. And indeed, I actually decided to build upon the article you cited in the Funambulist for today, because also I had been in attendance at the James Baldwin and Ghassan Kanafani Parallels panel earlier, and I work quite a lot with James Baldwin as well for many of the reasons that those panelists had articulated. But I have a very different experience in my academic work versus my reality also as a half Palestinian. So I am currently at work on a book that traces translational Blackness across Arabophone, Francophone, and Anglophone Afro-Arab communities in North Africa and in Europe. Broadly, my work explores how Black Arabs imagine and innovate and negotiate the languages to make legible who they are to non-Black Arabs and the broader African diaspora, and how African, Caribbean, and African American peoples do the same. These translations are often initially approached through metaphor or analogy, through the veil of shared but not quite the same experiences, of shared but not quite the same political investments and imaginaries and dreams for our collective liberation. For instance, James Baldwin's musings in No Name in the Street about how he had initially approached the question of Algerian liberation while living in Paris through, quote, an American racial framework, but was then prompted to recalibrate his understanding of the violent colonial relationship France imposed upon Algeria by recognizing that Algerians, like Black Americans, were also engaged in their own like struggle against white supremacy and imperialism. Another African-American writer, William Gardner Smith, a contemporary of Baldwin's, had much earlier summarized this analogous struggle for liberation as one that spanned from, quote, the Negroes of France to, quote, the Algerians of the US. These are moments of mutual recognition and commitment that Black freedom dreamers, to borrow from Robin Kelley's expansive framework, formed within the language of analogy. But analogy itself was never enough. Rather, as demonstrated by Martinican psychoanalyst and later member of the FLN, Frantz Fanon, decolonization, what he referred to as a program of complete disorder, requires a total commitment to the liberation of an other, of us all, not only our own, not only a struggle for liberation we can easily analogize to our own. Black and Palestinian and Indigenous solidarities, for instance, are a historical fact and enduring reality, but these are also solidarities that are always in progress. They are not yet fully realized. Its limits are not just structural, not only interpersonal, particularly when confronting anti-Blackness and settler erasure in our own communities, including anti-Blackness that targets other Palestinians. Its limits are also in the very language we use to articulate this solidarity and how we locate and articulate ourselves and our Palestinianness, often flattening very real and important distinctions that texture our plurality. We articulate ourselves and our liberation often within analogy. Your struggle is like my struggle is like yours. This is often very true. We know this is true. People have been talking about this the whole festival. But it is the start, the beginning of a path to freedom that we continue to map. Acknowledging first the dissonance within our own diaspora is deeply productive for imagining how together we will be free. Though we recognize one another as Palestinian, we are not always Palestinian in the same ways. We live alongside and within vast divides across class, race, politics, and much, much more. How we think of ourselves as Palestinian is not always mutually legible or mutually recognized. How we think of ourselves, our Palestinianness, our commitments to one another must always encourage recognition of and accountability to our collective multiplicity before our solidarity with others can be fully realized. We must be held to account for one another too. We must be held to account for risking drawing the borders of Palestine around us so thickly that we forget to hold open the doors for the dispossessed in whose dispossession we also participate. I'm trying to read very slowly and calmly for the benefit of the interpreter, so apologies for my pace. Who we are and our ways of knowing ourselves in the enduring Nakba has never been stable. We fashion ourselves from the pieces of us scattered across an entire world, unmoored, as diaspora is always an unmooring. Some of us are refugees, some of us remain. Some of us are exiled or the children and grandchildren of those dispossessed and in exile. We all live in the shadow of catastrophe, but we do not all bear the unending urgency of the continuous catastrophe this equally. In the midst of this, how do we know ourselves? Who do we become? Who have we decided to be? A commonly prescribed antidote to the dispossession prompted by such a disaster has been, for some, including many people in my family, nationalism, secure in our knowledge that we belong to a place, an affirmation of our homeland, a return, a cuisine, a flag, or as Mahmoud Darwish sarcastically put it, the homeland is not a dish of rice and lentils. But we also recognize that nationalism is a placebo at times, and Edward Said cogently attests to this in his very important essay, Reflections on Exile. Quote, in a very acute sense, exile is a solitude experienced outside the group, the deprivations felt at not being with others in the communal habitation. These deprivations cannot fully be recovered through a state, itself a reproduction of the violence endemic to the modern capitalist nation state. I've argued before that we must always push back against recognition only through statehood. We make space, not states. Within Said's additional proclamation that, quote, exile is a jealous state, the layered meaning of state is accidental and opportune. Exile is a jealous state, Said argues, for exile does not compel us to share in our humanity with others. Exile can prompt an unreasonable austerity of being. What Said points to as among, quote, the least attractive aspects of being in exile, an exaggerated sense of group solidarity, a passionate hostility to outsiders, even those who may be in fact be in the same predicament as you, also colors the state, in the absence of a state, of our Palestinianness. What if there is not enough freedom for all of us? And who constitutes us? Who have we become as Palestinians in the wake of the Nakba? I am the descendant of Falahin. My relatives are not refugees, though they endure, as do we all, the living memory of our disaster. These Palestinians, my Palestinians, also live today as settlers across these occupied lands. But exile is a jealous state. We make more exiles. We reproduce the conditions of exile everywhere we land. We do sometimes do this with one another as well. Where is your family from is perhaps the most frequent question Palestinians ask of one another. It is a familiar question, a demonstration of our mutual understanding and the possibility of our coherence as a people. But we do not always understand one another, and we are not always in community. And that question too can reveal the barriers between us. Knowing ourselves differently across Palestinianness is not a violence and it is not a disaster. It is simply the stratification present within and between our own ways of being and our own ways of knowing Palestine and Palestinianness. It is one paradox of exile, or as Mahmoud Darwish murmured to himself, I resemble you, yet I do not become you. I become you, but I do not resemble you. Cast over our Palestinianness, a Palestinianness in part today formed in the disaster, is the fear of uttering aloud that we are not Palestinian in precisely the same ways. Deeper still, in the soil feeding the roots of this knowledge, we might find a stubborn attachment to the politics of scarcity that the catastrophe wrought, that my freedom may not include your freedom, that our freedom is or will be contingent on the unfreedom of others. Sometimes this is not a fear, but a fact. And I have a lot of examples of that, but I'm gonna, in the interest of time, skip them, and I'm happy to elaborate later. We are a people. We may just not be a people, not yet. Attending to our particularities, quote, is not a desire to fight alone and a disdain for alliances, Aimé Césaire reminds us. We are always in the process of becoming Palestinians. When we dig deeply into our well of particulars to retrieve our collective desire to distinguish between alliance and subordination, solidarity and resignation, we enrich the attachments between ourselves. From exile in Beirut, Mahmoud Darwish once reflected, quote, "You're aliens here," they say to them there. "You're aliens here," they say to them here. And between here and there, they stretch their bodies like a vibrating bow until death celebrated itself through them. What if we make through our exile and all the paradoxes of our exile a cacophony of Palestinianness, not a lamentation, but zagrit, a kunun rather than a bow? You can tell I'm half Egyptian by how I just pronounced that. Apologies. What if we ask, as Darwish asks, are you what you were or what you are now? Maybe this feels too much like erasure. This could further separate us from our memories. These memories we have gathered and cultivated and curated and archived because no one else would, and because others have just tried to destroy our memories. But we do not draw upon our memories to resurrect them, whole and untouched. We plant and water and tend to our memories in order to inspire our practice of living alongside them, all of them. All we distinct and divergent Palestinians with our memories, a whole garden of memories to tend to while we grow another world anew. The land's skin may have changed, so have we. This is a piece of a dream, my love letter to who we are throughout our continuing catastrophe and our resistance to it. I would like this to mark a memory of our future freedom, an archive for our future. We will continue to know how to be Palestinian together when we are free. We will know better how to be Palestinian together as we are free. And just to close very quickly, I'm sorry, I'm getting confused by some other things happening, so I'm just going to focus on this for now.
Yes.
Comparatism, parallel, and analogy. These articulations may spark to life new solidarities, but what happens to our solidarities when the analogy ends? We do not build a solidarity that is solely indebted to the shared conditions of catastrophe. We commit ourselves to one another not only for our liberation struggle, but in order to upend the entirety of Western civilization. What will remain an integral part of our liberation and our commitments to other movements for liberation is a broader sense of how we are Palestinian, a commitment to continuously renewing our bonds across our many particularities, devoting ourselves to one another through what Aimé Césaire celebrated as, quote, the deepening and coexistence of all particulars. Thank you.
We did have, thank you so much, Sophia. We did have some technical difficulties. So, and since Nick isn't going to be here, do you want to, I want to give you the chance before we move on to Fady, if you wanted to summarize or reach back to some things that you thought maybe you'd like to have another chance to express. You don't have to, I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
I think if I had to summarize it, our exile reveals simultaneously where we are absent or where we may not recognize one another fully, but we have always been able to recognize one another in our relations. And so we must also know each other as layered and contradictory. Palestinianness is not a politically coherent identity, no more than any other, but there is a richness and a utility of exploring those depths rather than pretending they don't exist for the ease of being in solidarity with one another and with other movements.
It's wonderful. And again, I'm sure that people can pick that up in the Q&A and you'll have other chances. So thank you. And so now, Fady.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Sophia. That was lovely. I don't have anything written down. I will be less articulate than Sophia, so I'll stumble along with the generous audience with some thoughts. This notion of cultural dissonance and negotiating language, I just would like to put it today in the framework of a problematic dichotomy of Palestine in Arabic and Palestine in English. I will admit that I will speak in generalities. So there will be certain exceptions and nuances that I will miss and don't mean to dismiss. But I do believe that Palestine in Arabic, to state the obvious, has existed for a lot longer than Palestine in English has. Palestine in Arabic belongs to a history of the Arabic language and the Arabic culture that is as dynamic and varied as the 1500 years of that Arabic culture and its documentation. Of course, it goes even farther than that. As the poet Ghassan Zafkan says, we belong to 10,000 years of history when it comes to the Canaanite civilization, extinct now. Palestine in Arabic is free. The articulation of Palestine in Arabic does not have to explain itself in similar ways that Palestine in English has to explain itself. Palestine in Arabic is free to roam a wide range of expressions, and I mostly speak in literary and intellectual terms, where, for example, I was just watching a poetry roundtable with 3 Palestinian women poets, Maya Abul Hayat, Ahlam Sharat, who is part of the conference, and Asma Azaiza. And this was a few weeks ago. And the 3 women said nothing about, when they talked about poetry and talked about literature, they said nothing of occupation, resistance, dispossession, racism, not because they're ignorant of it and not because they don't suffer it, but because they can express in Palestine in Arabic with a particular freedom and affirmation of life and love that is a bit, perhaps arguably, more organic and coherent in Arabic than it comes into English. Palestine in English, I would argue, is nascent. In the Palestinian experience, up, arguably, let's say 20 years ago or a generation ago, you had most of the influence of on the Palestinian identity, or Palestine and Palestinians, had one common denominator, and that is the Arabic language and Arabic culture. In the last generation or so, for various historic reasons, none of them judgmental or preferential, just the features of time, Palestine in English is more removed from Arabic language and Arabic culture than Palestine had been previously. And when I say that, I mean the presence of Palestine in English, the presence of Palestine in American English in particular, which is to say in Imperial American English. Palestine enters English through the framework of empire. And through the framework, and let's not, I'm trying to skip the British conversation. We'll focus on the active empire of the day. And so when we speak of Palestine, when I think of Palestine in English, I think of Palestine again within the framework of the American empire, even if that means within the oppressed communities who seek solidarity with each other within the framework of the American empire. I also tend to think that Palestine was, forgive my poetic loose expressions, born internationalist. For at least 100 years, Palestine and Palestinians had been quite immediately aware that they have to seek solidarity outside their boundaries in order to continue to be a people. I am not entirely sure that all the histories of resistance and solidarity within American empire have had that experience of internationalism. Again, just a matter of historical and geographical features. And I think that internationalism comes in the United States as an episodic event. And so Palestine in English for me brings in the question of internationalism. I think that as an American engaged in activism and resistance, I imagine I would come into the question of Palestine having to ask myself immediately about questions of internationalism. Another way to say it is, Palestine in English is exterior to English, where many other forms of solidarities in American English are interior to it. Palestine remains in the solidarity sphere as a complicated example of foreign policy and not part of the sort of internal fabric, away, of course, from the hopeful and necessary language of coming together, which, of course, we all believe in. I do believe that also Palestine in English is, in American English, finds itself having to negotiate what I would call the moral, ethical paradigms of resistance within the American framework. These are not universal moral and ethical paradigms of resistance, of solidarity, of coming together, of union. There is also the impressive reality of Palestine in English being Palestine in the vortex, the immense magnetic field of the imperial framework. It seems that America, even in its sense of solidarity and resistance, is one can say, a center of the world. That even Palestine in Arabic has to sort of come into Palestine in English and say, here I am, where it does not really have to, what terms do I have to negotiate in order for us to become one, in order for the exterior to approximate the interior. I think these are issues that matter to me because I think repeatedly there is a language, an American English, a diction of Palestine that distances me from what Palestine is in Arabic. And I think that is worth conversing more openly about. I think that also touches literature. The way I just mentioned, the 3 Palestinian women who can sit in a round table in Ramallah and talk about their first encounters of poetry having to do with listening to the poetry in Proverbs, or that their grandparents were reciting poems that they were intoxicated by the music of it, and whether they did or did not understand it and whatnot. Where here, a Palestinian American poet has to constantly negotiate 2 major currents. One is, how do I suck it to the man and say white this, white that, and the other? And how do I not engage the aesthetics in a manner that allows the system to co-opt me as a sellout or as some sort of a liberal variant of the palatable Palestinian? So I do think that these are issues I sort of like to pose. I do think that there is the contemporary suffering of Palestine and Palestinians is ongoing, not exclusive of other places in the region in particular. There is a way in which I think we tend to speak of Palestine in English in a way that really, much as we think otherwise, I would like to be provocative and say, is really dissociated from the reality of what Palestinians, and of course the whole Arab region now, which is whose suffering is never unlinked or decoupled from the Palestinian question. And so, and you know, I know this sounds like I just went pretty quick and pretty briefly, but let me see if I have any other useful notes. Yes, and I just want again to say I think it is important not to. I worry about the pitfalls of exporting paradigms of solidarity from, you know, from within the imperial framework. I understand that communities of the oppressed communities in the U.S. are varied, have different experiences, immense historical suffering. But I also think that we forget that often we are imperial subjects and we possess imperial benefits, even in our aesthetic and intellectual articulations and arguments. And the change that we believe in and we can wield within empire is, and we sometimes see even snippets of it, little by little, law here, law there, publication here, publication there, can be intoxicating because it does not happen to others elsewhere. And it might lead us to think that we can actually export this kind of solidarity as a form, you know, that again, even unintentionally does not listen to Palestine in Arabic.
Thank you so much, Fady. We have about 4 questions in the Q&A, but why don't we do this? I'd like you two to talk to each other as well. I mean, you did sort of, you know, implicitly, but why don't we let Sophia, you know, remark, comment, respond to anything Fady might have said or vice versa. And then I will take the 4 questions and give them to you all at once so you can sort of think about them. But let's go to Sophia first if you want. You don't have to, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
Thank you, and thank you, Fady. You were very articulate. I have to write things down because I am a fundamentally inarticulate person. I'm still processing, and I'll probably need a little more time to think through what you had just mentioned, but I think maybe one thing, and I apologize if this is based on a misunderstanding because I am still thinking through this. I guess I have to wonder if we look, and I'm thinking here of specifically like research done by a wonderful colleague, Alex Lubin, on Black internationalism and particularly like the Afro-Arab world, and how Black Americans or Black folks in this in the Western Hemisphere, you know, had always thought through and with Palestine as a even before the Nakba, right? Had thought with the Arab world. To understand themselves as well as colonial subjects, right? And how those colonial subjectivities, and I know this is ironic because I just argued for particularities above all, but there are still, right, these deep, deep similarities and routed formations of imperial subjectivity that do cross languages and regions and historical contexts, which of course you also affirmed. But I wonder if when you mention the pitfalls of exporting paradigms of solidarity from an imperial framework or from the West, maybe as a shorthand, how we then understand Black anti-colonialism, Black internationalism, Indigenous internationalism. Personally, and I don't know, others may disagree, I think of those as also expressly internationalist as their base because they must be as well for this many of similar but different reasons as among Palestinians. I guess I'm asking you a question now, Fady, instead of engaging in a dialogue, but I wonder if you might say more about that provocation you made about the exportation of solidarities. I would love to hear more.
I think that I would be honest to say that my articulation is actually to say that there has, in my opinion, to come a point where, or at least I am of the opinion that there is a sort of a gray zone between entrapment and the unanswerable. I am not entirely, there's no answer I can give you, and this is part of the whole problem, is that what happens if we actually don't ask your questions? What happens if we actually just talk and think about Palestine in Arabic? What happens if it is not always a question of how does one make the disclaimers and make sure that one is not under some kind of misunderstanding, lack of solidarity, problematics of loyalty oaths. I am not sure that, you know, that there is I am sure there is a major distinction between the Black American experience and the African experience in the anti-colonial you know, resistance. And I say these are not preferential, these are historical features, and they're not sweeping. But I think, you know, we mentioned Fanon, we mentioned Aimé Césaire, you know, it's a bit different, the Black American experience than the African experience. So those things, just like there are many Palestinianness, there are many kinds of Blackness, and those experiences are historically different. And I think even the relationship that I may have with a Nigerian and talking about Palestine may have certain immediacies and connections that may not always be available if I come from the outside. I mean, am I answering you as a Palestinian in Arabic, or am I answering you as a Palestinian in English? I mean, I want to go back to that original. You know, are we able to be patient enough to listen to a Palestinian in Gaza when we think of these solidarity frameworks? A Palestinian in Ain al-Hilwa, or in Egypt. It's not about erasing the presence or the resistance or the solidarity of anyone or minimizing it. It's just about shifting focus.
Great. I think we have a lot of questions that are hovering around the same kinds of issues. So I'm going to just read a few and you can take notes and then respond to them in kind. So we'll do it in clusters rather than one by one. So one is, how can we be in community as we are split again and again from each other and our family members? Our exile multiplies as we travel for jobs or go to find a home. To Sophia again, do you feel that the jealousy of exile risks us becoming exclusionary and nationalistic? I think this is something you talked about, and simply reactionary. In other words, perpetuating the same pattern from which the conflict originated in Europe, ethno-nationalism. Two more, and then I'll let you respond. Fady, there's a difference between Palestine English in the public sphere and Palestine English in the private sphere, like in family settings with family members who are mixed and dwell in different countries, in addition to our meetings with our Arabic gatherings. So let's work with those for a bit. I'll let you both respond.
Yeah, I guess I can begin, I think, with the first two questions. I think, and they're very related. So I think Leila is correct, right? Our exile, that's the meaning of diaspora, right? Diaspora is ever impacting many diasporic communities, the Jewish diaspora, the Black diaspora, and of course, including the Palestinian diaspora. And not only because of not only out of the immediate impact of violence or catastrophe, but of course, because of how we are mobilized as subjects of capitalism, of the economy, of further imperialisms, as Fady noted, right? Palestinians who are in other countries and are forced to move again and again. And I find something I find so hopeful, and this is why I describe what I was sharing with you all as a love letter, is we do continuously recognize ourselves in community regardless, right? And then it just gets into maybe what the second question began to address with how do we resist refashioning or whether unintentionally or not, how do we resist gosh, I'm losing the word here, essentially redeploying the same logics that we endure as colonial subjects and subjects in exile or in refugee camps and so on. And that's a question that every liberation movement has ever had to ask itself, right? I mean, this is none of what I shared is unique to Palestinians. Even in there are so many particularities that make our experiences unique in other forms. Some of the examples about that austerity of freedom I was articulating that I didn't share are Palestinians who throughout Latin America who supported fascist dictatorships in the 20th century, from Chile to Honduras. Palestinians, Palestinian Americans who deputize themselves to police majority Black and Latinx neighborhoods and open up shops in these spaces. Unfortunately, the murder of George Floyd was not the first time that a shop owned by a Palestinian in a majority Black neighborhood had been directly or indirectly involved in the facilitation of anti-Black police violence in this country. And I think I'm also conscious that I'm speaking probably with many people who also recognize these contradictions and these worries. It's not inevitable that we would reproduce these violences. It's not, but it does require us to reconcile with ourselves the need to address these distinctions within our own communities. There's anti-Blackness in my own family because of the particular interracial, relationships therein. And it's very strange to me to sort of observe how folks talk about, let's say, anti-Blackness in their own Palestinian communities. And this is just one of many examples. We could talk about gender segregation and disability and so on, so many other things. But I'm sorry, and I'm speaking too quickly now. I'm going to try to slow down. But we resist perpetuating the same problems by attending to the fact that these will always be problems. They don't have to be, though. We have in ourselves, we have the ability to always hold one another to account. And that, I think, facilitates our participation and commitment to other internationalist movements and other internationalist frameworks by recognizing, these patterns, these historical patterns, but also recognizing our own multiplicity. And I'm conscious that there's a tiny fly in here and I look like Mike Pence in that one debate. So I'm gonna stop talking now and try and shoo it away.
Yeah, I'm on, okay. Yeah, no, I think that, again, I go back to, how does one speak Palestine in Arabic and how does one speak Palestine in English? Do I benefit or do I want to engage in saying, well, Du Bois wrote in favor of Zionism, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, etc. Of course, all these things are good to share and address openly and honestly. But I do I do wonder again about the framework from which these things are spoken. And I would like to say that, in my writing, we each have a different tool or several tools available to us. And one of the tools I have available to me is my relationship to Arabic. I've learned over the years, and it's not just a matter of translation, but it's also how Arabic influences my writing in English, or that I turned to writing in Arabic in the recent years, because it does make me engage a long history, and it frees me up from a particular dialectic and a glossary and a lexicon that I feel that in English I cannot exist as a Palestinian without having to learn how to articulate myself through that dictionary. There's nothing wrong with any dictionary, but there are many dictionaries. And I guess that's what Sophia's been saying, that we all in the end seek commonalities and communities.
Okay, I'll read a few more. This is for Fady. Thanks so much for sharing your important perspective. I wonder how you negotiate the differences in Palestine in Arabic and in English when you translate poetry from Arabic to English. Second question is, Fady makes a really good point about always remembering, let's see, it's skipping around for me now. Always remembering that even resistances come from the US, come from the Imperial Center. A good example is the exportation of, and we talked a little bit of the BLM movement post George Floyd all over the globe. I'm a bit confused about your conflation of issues of language and space. For example, Palestine in English, in American English versus Palestine in Arabic, and Palestine's in the diaspora in Palestine versus Palestine's in Palestine. Could you explain? So I guess there are two parts to that, and you can choose either one or both. And finally, one more. This is again back to Sophia. Sophia said Palestinian is not a political identity. That's a paraphrase. And I'm wondering what the political consequences of making that claim is. In concrete terms, what do you erase as you claim to make room in this way? How is particularities and its fetishization something Palestinians have in fact struggled with because it can be so destructive? What kind of political project does this claim far beyond poetics? So I'll let you both address those before we move on.
I'll be brief and let Sophia have the last word, perhaps. I think it's good to be confused. And I think that, one should stay along with this. I think that I would like to add that, there is something about, again, this Palestine in English and Palestine in Arabic provocation that I have posed, that again centers the conversation about America and not about Palestine. And centers the conversation even in not all, but in some of the racial conversations that we have about whiteness and not. The whiteness in America is always brought into the center, even in ignominy. It's brought into the center, and we have to negotiate it, and we have to address it, and we have to, validate it or validate ourselves through it, even by cussing it out. And even by the diction that we write. I mean, how did I negotiate translation? I just did not think that I was worried about who would tell me that my English was good or not good enough. I was wondering whether I could exist in a sphere that maybe 20 years somebody can read as a Ringlish, and think about what that means, without necessarily, because, Palestine doesn't have an accent in English. Doesn't have a pigeon. It doesn't have, there's all these kind of, and suddenly Palestine, and we're talking about just a massive force of empire. And I think, I think it's something I hold to intensely. I think It keeps me, it's sort of like meditation. Palestine in Arabic for me is meditation. A lot of the noise rolls, and this is not to dismiss any suffering, any solidarity, any struggle. It actually brings clarity. So one can love without self-loathing.
I really appreciate that, Fady, and I think you clarified something I was still working through about your initial remarks. The centering of the US as the issue foundationally, rather than folks who are organizing, right, to address there are other forms of imperialism that are present here. And I hope this might relate to the question that was asked of me. I did say, yes, Palestinianness is not a politically coherent identity, nor is Blackness, nor is being Indigenous. These do not, being Palestinian does not inscribe upon us, an automatic understanding of oppression and all the circuitry of capitalist extraction and imperialism and so on. But even as we recognize that identity is not politics, we have a concrete history, and somebody brought this up in the chat. And of course, I did mention this as well in my initial remarks. We have so many examples from our own diasporic Palestinian communities, as well as folks, right, still in Palestine and in the camps and living under occupation as unequal citizen or unequal residents in the state of Israel. That commitment, our commitment is political, and it can reach political coherence across the vastness of our diaspora. I think there was another part of the question that I may have. There's one part of this question that how is the particularities and its fetishization something Palestinians have in fact struggled with because it can be so destructive? What kind of political project does this claim far beyond poetics? I've actually struggled with this. I think many young Palestinians have struggled with this at some point, where we are maybe embraced and lifted up and encouraged by non-Palestinian allies when we are useful as native informants in particular spaces. But once we begin to articulate or develop our own political approach or question certain kind of givens, our Palestinianness becomes less useful. And so I think that this is something that some others had remarked in another conversation the other day. But there is a way in which the fact that Palestinians are treated, not by Palestinians ourselves, I think, but mostly by non-Palestinians, as sort of a politically uniform community of people who all, because we may, although not all Palestinians are anti-occupation, I think that's also important to remember. Palestinians who build massive settlements on Palestinian territory that looks a lot like the other settlements we know so much about, which the architect Leopold Lambert has written quite a lot about. But when we recognize the distinctions within our own communities and within our solidarity movements, right, with those who are in solidarity with us, I think it also asks everyone else, right, not just us of ourselves, but everyone around us to, welcome the multiplicity of perspectives and the pushback, right, that we might offer one another as we try to speak, as we try to imagine, right, a Palestinian futurity after, the occupation ends. And I think that's always my goal, my focus. And I know we all share in that. And that's what we have in common. And that's what we can continue to have in common as we work through these other particularities.
So
and just to clarify one thing, I'm not speaking about Palestinian laborers. I'm actually speaking about financiers who, and I can provide resources maybe for folks who want those.
No, I just realized I'm doing more work than I need to, which is not like me. So Fady and Sophia, you can see the Q&A, right? You can see the questions?
I just found that out. Yes.
Yeah. Why don't I let you all, since you should be able to choose the questions that you think, because some of them replicate each other a little bit, and maybe you've touched on them. So I want to give you the chance, since you've done so much work, to each choose a question that you'd like to respond to next, rather than have me mediate. And either one go first. And then we have about 12 minutes left, I think. So I'd like to give you both the last word, anything you want to repeat or emphasize before we go out, but we still have some time for questions. So why don't you take a look and just answer as you feel like.
There are a lot, sorry.
There's a good question for you, Sophia, on strategic Palestinianness.
Oh, yeah. Huh.
I would like to just say while you think about that, because it looks like it's a question that requires some thinking, at least for me. But I would like to say that I think ultimately, it's good to think about, for me, about Palestine in any language through love as a force of liberation. And I don't mean love as in a kumbaya kind of thing, but in a sense where we do recognize that we are incomplete human beings, and this notion of sometimes seeking the victim or the oppressed to be perfect or to aim toward perfection has always been problematic for me. And I perhaps am hypersensitive to misconstruing these emotions as they arrive into me. But I feel like there's a lot more beautiful stuff we can all say to each other without necessarily being naive and delusional about the hard work and the 20 meters of the impossible, as to quote Darwish, that we have to overcome. Yeah, and that's really, I guess that's all.
I guess to continue on the Darwish train, probably one of the most important, for me, a theorist, right, of how I think of my relation to this topic and these questions. In his self-elegy, In the Presence of Absence, which is beautiful, and the translation by Sinan Antoun is also beautiful for English readers. He asks, what does it mean for a Palestinian to be a poet, and what does it mean for a poet to be a Palestinian? And he asks this question, or it's a question that's asked of him, the narrator of this self-elegy. And it's not about strategic Palestinianness per se, but something that he realizes in the context of this question, which is followed up with, what would you write without the occupation? He says, I would write better. And so I don't know necessarily, strategic Palestinianness definitely gives me strategic essentialism vibes, and this is probably the fault of my training in cultural theory and Black cultural studies in particular. But I don't know if that's necessarily the framework I would denote as being useful, but recognizing always in our current, and again, other panels, and I think in this one today, folks are addressing not just the history. We don't just emerge and respond only to the occupation. And in Fady's remarks made this very clear. There's a long history of a plural community of Palestinians that has always been present. So we're not formed in the Nakba, but we certainly have had to reimagine our relations as a community. in light of the widespread dispossession and dispersal of Palestinians as a result of the Nakba. But we have continued to reimagine not only who we are now and how we come together and recognize one another, but also who we will be when we are free. And I'm sorry, that sounded like I was citing myself. I'm not trying to cite myself, but who will we be when we are free? It's not just a question, right? It's a rumination. We're all involved in this, and it must be collective. And I'm hopeful, of course, because it already is. This is not a prescription per se. This is just an embrace, again, a love letter to all of the perspectives, positions, and insights that we all have to offer because of our very different experiences of being Palestinian. We enliven one another by putting these together, and it enriches our movements, our collective movements for our total liberation.
Well, I'd just like to say a couple of things, picking up on what you've both said. And one is that when I do my course on Palestine, I teach Darwish, and I teach his love poems too, right? Because just looking at one side just categorizes it in that way. And that there's also a very wonderful exhibit in Paris from time to time called For a National Museum of Palestine. And it's a wonderful mixture of very important photographs and paintings that are historical, and the others that are just completely abstract. I mean, you couldn't, for the life of you, try to figure out a political message. I mean, you could do that with anything. But when you were speaking, I was also thinking of the work of somebody who's one of the people who's endorsed Palestine rights, and that's Viet Thanh Nguyen and his work, because there was so many Vietnamese American writers who felt they had to talk about the war. I mean, it was such a fundamental part of their experience that to break out of that mold was to de-authenticize themselves. Like, you can't really be Vietnamese if you can bypass that on the way to another vision of yourself. And of course, the Vietnamese community was very much split north and south, generations and generations. And so the whole claim toward identity was fraught. But I was thinking that even in that case, it's not the same as Palestine. I mean, there's so many things that one could link to it. But, the fact is that the Vietnamese have a nation state. The Palestinians don't. So these questions become even more fraught when we talk about Palestine. And I love the one thing that Sophia brought up in the middle was alike, but not alike enough. And so it's that margin and that negotiation that is also very political. And Mark Lamont Hill earlier today was talking about some of the criticism he got for coming out for Palestine, because Black activists said, by doing that, you're diminishing your power in the Black community. And he said, he didn't see it that way, but on the other hand, he recognized the political reality of that, right? That one has so much political capital, so to speak, or power to use. So we have about 4 minutes. I'd like to give you both 2 minutes to say anything you'd like to do. I also encourage everybody in the audience, if you haven't already, please pick up the work of these two amazing writers, and please follow them on Facebook or Twitter or any social media. Look them up. They have great websites, and I hope this gave you a taste of what they can do. But I'll let you two finish up.
Fady, do you want to go first? Should I?
Sure. I just not a closing argument, just a thought on also, I've always I've raised this point with several Vietnamese writers, colleagues. What can one make? And I don't know the answer of the fact that most of the Vietnamese American community also comes from a particular sort of subgroup of Vietnamese that were, sort of South Vietnam during the war, and that also introduces a narrative of the, but just like obviously it has its commonality with the entirety of the Vietnamese experience, but it also has its specificity within the particularity of the American Vietnamese experience. And yet, because, you know, you don't win a Pulitzer in Vietnam, you win it in the United States, you know, what does that, you know, what does that do, if anything? And, you know, you talk about Darwish and love poems. I think it's, you know, it's about like, how, you know, is a Palestinian, I mean, maybe it's a rhetorical question, but is a Palestinian allowed to write about love in English and be believed? Let me just put it this way.
Yeah. I guess just to close, rather than making any new points, I would just really like to thank Fady and David as well for just being really awesome interlocutors. And I'm gonna save the chat so I can dig through it more deeply, because I think a lot of the audience members were also offering some really wonderful debates and provocations and perspectives that I hope to immerse myself in later. But I guess if there's one thing, you know, that I would just hope folks take away from this, and I'm happy to share remarks or resources with anyone who would like to reach out. You can just Google me for my email. You know, I come to this from the field of the intellectual orientation of Black studies, which is what I am trained in and committed to politically and intellectually. But Black studies has always opened up for me the richness, the textures and possibilities of both solidarity work, but also the tensions that underlie a lot of our attempts to reach out to one another and do the work together. So I'm totally comfortable and happy with all the unanswered questions and loose endings we're leaving off with. And I look forward to listening to more throughout the rest of the festival. Thank you all.
Well, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Fady and Sophia, for a really stimulating, provocative, and powerful set of comments. So please enjoy the rest of the festival, and we'll see you later.